Get on the train before it leaves the station. The truth train is coming, gonna run them down, run them down.
Hello there, everybody. How you doing? Okay, tonight we are here to talk about the bones in this, latest installment of my little countdown till Christmas. Obviously it's been pretty rough. I decided to do this thing to do an upload every day, and then that news about Brendan came down, which was like a kick in the teeth to all of us and everything. And it's like, it's been a little rough, but I'm reminded of a video, a TED Talk that I really, really like, that I did a video about last New Year's actually, and I'll put a link to that down below so folks that don't know what I'm talking about can see it. But a lot of folks that have been with me for a while know what I'm talking about. In fact, here.
You see, friends, what makes you comfortable can ruin you. And what makes you uncomfortable is the only way to grow.
So whenever things get a bit hectic and, we get a piece of, bad news, I always remind myself of that and kind of almost use it like a mantra to just remember that, even though it's uncomfortable, maybe sometimes that is, really a path to growth. And as I covered in the previous video that I did, which as I said, I'll leave the link below, it's being uncomfortable and in that state of growth that we overcome being uncomfortable in that situation or those situations, because we learn how to deal with them efficiently, but that's part of growth. So we learn how to deal with them efficiently, and then when those situations come up on us again later in the future, they aren't so overwhelming. And that's one of the great things about growth. So just something for people to keep in mind. I know with the news about Brendan and everything, it can be a little disheartening, but don't let it get you down, because trust me, folks, and part of the reason why I'm continuing to get these videos out here, counting down to Christmas, is to keep the heat on. The lawyers are doing their part and keeping the heat on. So we need to continue to do our part and support Stephen and Brendan to continue to keep that heat on and keep that white hot spotlight on, Wisconsin and these agents who we, clearly see are being very dishonest. And that's what I'm pointing out. So just remember that, Stephen and Laura, Stephen Drizzen and Laura Nyrider, they initiated this path to a pardon and clemency, right? And they exercised this option because it was a way that Brendan would get out, quickly, if it was granted, that he would just get out a lot quicker than the route where they have to go through the courts and all the appeals that would, even if they're successful, then all the appeals, and they have to be successful on the appeals. And so with the prospect of how long that would definitely take, they chose to try this option first. So it's not exactly the end of the world, but obviously it wasn't. We would have liked a different answer, but just I want to point something out to everybody. When they initiated this, do you guys remember? Ken Kratz was out in the media. He was talking about how his book was coming out on paperback. It was going to have 2 extra chapters, and one of those chapters was going to be dealing with the fact that he thinks Brendan should be able to get out time served, that he served enough time, and like trying to, I guess, curry some favor with Brendan supporters by saying he thinks Brendan should get out and that he should get time served at this point or whatever, right? But then look what happens when Laura Nyrider and Stephen Drizzen filed for the clemency. He immediately betrayed himself. And it's like we get to see the two faces of Kratz, right? So he immediately betrays himself. So I'm going to be doing a much more, in-depth video about Brendan as the number 1 day, the final day. That will be Christmas Eve, and I will be doing a more of a deep dive as far as it goes with Brendan, because he's going to be the number 1. So I will get to that then. Now let's get to the bones, right? Because that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the bones today. So there's so much to talk about when it comes to the bones, really. You think about it. Okay, so let's start with the fact that the prosecution claims at trial, it's set in stone. The prosecution claims that Stephen Avery's burn pit is the primary burn location. Okay, we know from testimony from Dr. Eisenberg, the prosecution's own forensic anthropologist, who they sent the bones to, we know from her that they only recovered 2/5 of what would normally constitute the full cremains of a human body, approximately Teresa Halbach's size and weight. That it would be that they only found 2/5 of it, and that ultimately what the amount that would be left over after a cremation would be enough to just a little bit more than it would basically overfill a 2-liter bottle. A little bit more than a 2-liter bottle is about how much there would be. So she says in testimony they only found 2/5 of that. Then you have like all the bones scattered across 2 neighboring properties and all the activity on Cuss Road. Right? Because this is important, because when I point out what I just pointed out, that they only found 2/5 of the cremains in Stephen Avery's burn pit, the supposed primary burn location, primary burn site, right? Then we have these bones being found scattered across the quarries, which Eisenberg clearly in her early reports believes to be human, and that they quite possibly belong to Teresa. That's her early beliefs. But then just before trial, she makes another report where she basically says she can't determine what those bones in the quarries and all that stuff are. So it's a slight change in her opinion, but it's right before trial. And that's why at trial they're able to claim things like, oh, I'm not even going to spend 20 seconds on those bones because the best that can be said is that they're possible human. That's how Ken Kratz was able to say that, because Leslie Eisenberg issued out a second report in which she claimed those bones were only possible human. But previous to that, she had believed that they were human. She just wasn't sure if she could say that they were Teresa's, but she was sure they were human. So it's that interesting shift in opinion just before trial. Then at trial, they're able to say the things like I just said about the 20 seconds. Then after trial, they obviously go right back to thinking those bones are Teresa's. Okay? Because they end up going down there one day, Fallon and Gahn, 2 of the prosecutors in this case, and they go through all those bags and they pick out the bones that in Leslie Eisenberg's early reports that she believes were human and that she believed maybe Teresa's. And they pulled those all out and sent those back, sent them to Whiting Funeral Home so that they could be buried, basically giving them back to the family. Okay? So we have this clear belief. Then right at trial, when it's important for them to want to hide it, they change their opinion, and those are only possible human bones. And then after trial in 2011, they're back to being Teresa's bones again. I think that's interesting. See, watching that opinion, watching that shift the way it does, particularly right at trial. Right? So, okay. So that's all fishy and enough, right? But it suggests impropriety. And this is, the prosecutors. Look, Fallon is the Assistant Attorney General at the DOJ. Okay? He's the Assistant Attorney General of the state of Wisconsin. Okay? And he's there, taking part in this giving back of the bones, right? So we'll get to the giving back of the bones a little bit more in depth later in the video. Okay, back to Cuss Road. On Cuss Road, we have a whole bunch of activity. A really kind of just a staggering amount of activity, but really not very much explanation for all of said activity. And that's weird. And then we have all the bones that are scattered across the neighboring properties to the salvage yard, which are over closer to Kuss Road, interestingly enough. And so we have all this activity. We have the bones found over there. We have even a male DNA profile found out there near some bones. And it's just, well, it's a partial profile. It's profile CX, but it's a partial. And so you can't really get enough from it, but might have been able to be sent in for a mitochondrial DNA test, and that might have been able to shed some light on it. Who knows? It wasn't done though. So, all right. So we have all that strange stuff going on Kuss Road. Not only do we have this rather prolific amount of activity over there, and very little explanation for it, but we also know that we have Michael Bushman over there. And as I've been pointing out in this series, it's very, very interesting that Michael Bushman is there, because he actually ends up pushing to get crime scene tech Ertl called over to Kuss Road to excavate a strange patch of earth. Ertl ends up saying it was just a dead tree, and that's the official story. But it's odd that once again Michael Bushman is involved. He's over there on Kuss Road apparently for about 8 hours on the 7th. Okay, that's the day right before the bones are found, folks. The day right before the bones are found. There's a whole bunch of activity over on Kuss Road. Mostly, for a large part unexplained. And then the next day, we have a Manitowoc County Sheriff's officer and an officer, Sturdivant, finding the bones over by Stephen Avery's burn pit, supposedly. But they're seeing them on top of the soil when it had been raining. So that's another interesting little tidbit. The point is that there's this strange activity going on Kuss Road on the 7th. Ertl being called over there, but then when the bones are found on the 8th at Avery's burn pit, Ertl's not called. He's an afterthought later, because they think, oh, you know what? Let's see if we can get his sifting equipment. So he's kind of an afterthought to them. But the previous day, they brought him over to dig up a dead tree. You understand, like, how how it doesn't really wash or make sense, right? And like I said, Michael Bushman, he was on the original arrest party for Stephen Avery back in 1985. He was on the arrest party for Stephen Avery in 1985, okay? He was a deputy for Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department back then. He's a good friend of Peterson's, okay? And he was there for that. And then he's coming out of retirement to help with the Halbach investigation when there's a clear conflict of interest with the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department because of its involvement in Stephen Avery's prior, first wrongful conviction, right? And they think, oh, I know, we'll bring out retired officers who are actually there on the arrest party. But they bar the coroner, who didn't have a conflict of interest because Benny Burnson wasn't dead. So the coroner didn't have a conflict of interest, was going to be bringing a forensic anthropologist, which is what would have been needed and should have been brought in. Instead of having a bunch of officers trying to trump up their like fire inspector kind of qualifications or whatever, they're just trumping up some little qualification they have in terms of arson inspection or something like that, but has not. They have no biological. I'm sure they have very little biological training to be able to. So they shouldn't have been doing what they did. But the coroner was going to be bringing the proper person to be able to do it, and was barred. And so, like I said, when you have that person who was actually trying to do their job right, being barred, and they're bringing in retired deputies from a department that has a conflict of interest, who are retired, and who were on Stephen Avery's original arrest party back in 1985. That's just bizarre. That's just bizarre. And so I'm going to keep hammering on it because it's just damn bizarre. So we move to the 8th. The bones are getting found in Stephen Avery's burn pit. They start sifting whatever. Ertl's an afterthought. They ask him to bring sifting equipment after they've already, basically torn up the scene, essentially, as Ertl says in testimony, that the reason they didn't take pictures is because the scene was already obviously altered by the time they were called there. It's funny they were calling him out so quick for a dead stump over on Cuss Road, but didn't call him out and his team out for this, for the bones at the fire pit. Just saying how really odd and strange that is. So, they collect the bones the way they did. They end up shipping them to Madison to Leslie Eisenberg in boxes. One of the interesting things, Leslie Eisenberg claims to smell no rubber. That was a big part of the prosecution's claim that the tires were used to create the heat that it would take to burn Teresa's body like that. Okay. But these bones had no smell of rubber or any rubber residue of any kind on them. It's just bizarre. That there's only 2/5 of her remains there. It suggests that there was another burn site and that these bones were moved to Stephen Avery's burn pit. And we have a whole bunch of them scattered across 2 different neighboring properties. Or at least what are believed to be Teresa's, scattered across 2 neighboring properties. That's just... The prosecution didn't want the jury to believe that those bones scattered across 2 neighboring properties were Teresa's. The reason why is the jury would have been like, wait. That would have probably caused a lot of members on the jury to just be like, wait, whoa. Why are bones being found on 2 different properties? It would have created doubt in their minds. And any kind of doubt with a jury can end up in reasonable doubt when it comes to the prosecution and the way that they see it. So that's why they didn't want to acknowledge those bones, and they didn't want, they couldn't spend, that's why they will only spend 20 seconds on those bones, because they could only be deemed possible human. Right? All right. So that brings us into, so there's all that just strangeness about the bones. There's the stuff with Burn Barrel 4 being sent back to the Avery property, then Ken Kratz himself asking for Burn Barrel 4 to be brought back to Calumet long-term storage. Just all the odd things that go on with these bones and barrels and everything that's just odd, right? Okay, so then we move into 2011. Norm Gahn and Tom Fallon are there going through the bags of bones that were scattered in the 2 quarries, and they're picking out the bones that Leslie Eisenberg's early reports show to be human, that she believed were human. And they're picking all those out to be sent back to the Hall box. Now, here hangs a tale, because as they were doing this thing, they were generating a report that went into the CASO files, and so that we have it's part of the investigation reports. They created ledgers showing and logged what they were doing in ledgers. Okay? Here's what they didn't do. And this shows that they knew what they were doing was wrong. They knew that what they were doing violated statute. Okay? Because neither the investigation report pages that got generated for CASO, and none of the altered ledgers that showed what that they had gone through and picked out certain bones, all that updated ledgers of what they had done in September of 2011, that none of that made it over to Stephen Avery and his lawyers at the time. And Stephen Avery did have counsel at the time because he was on appeal. So none of that stuff made it over to Stephen Avery and his lawyers. He was not asked, and that was a violation of statute, because before biological evidence like that can be given back, which is technically destroying it, because it gets contaminated a lot of different reasons, but it was given back, and because that was done, it violated Stephen Avery's right to due process, because they didn't ask him if he wanted to test it. They didn't give him any option. They didn't ask him or anything. They just did it. And technically, by statute, they are supposed to ask first. And the fact that they didn't is a problem. So, yeah. That's the fact that they were hiding what they were doing. Obviously, they knew what they were doing was wrong. Okay? So that's what's going on in September 2011. Okay, now we fast forward to last year, December of 2018. Here we are in December of 2019. But back last year, to December 2018, on the 18th of December, Kathleen Zellner filed a motion. She wanted to test the bones from that she had seen in Leslie Eisenberg's early reports that she believed to be human. And so she was asking to test those bones using a new form of DNA testing called the Andy DNA testing method, which had been being used in the California wildfires to identify people who had been killed in the wildfires and stuff like that. And so she wanted to use this testing on the bones to prove that they were Teresa's bones scattered across the quarries, because that's obviously creates more problems for the prosecution's case. So that's what she was asking. But that's when we all realized, because we had gotten we had crowdsourced the investigation reports and all that stuff in 2015. Those pages, all that stuff had been added to it at that point, so we got all of it. So we all had pages in the website that where we go to look at the CASO and all the court documents. We had those pages, but Kathleen Zellner didn't. And so we immediately did a video. People were emailing her and calling her and letting her know that those bones had been given back, and obviously sending her the pages and all that sort of stuff. And eventually the testing got denied, and then she filed a new motion basically saying that Stephen Avery's due process had been violated by these bones being given back. And that's when the Court of Appeals remanded it back to the circuit court for fact finding, because the state had argued that Stephen was procedurally barred and that he should drop his current appeal to pursue the bone issue and all that sort of stuff. And the Court of Appeals just found that to be very unamusing. Sent it back for fact finding, and ultimately we end up with the state uttering the words, "We didn't violate statute because we gave the family animal bones." That's the kind of pressure, folks, that these lawyers are exerting on the agents of Wisconsin, along with us. Okay? That's the kind of pressure. Kathleen Zellner got the state to say in a filing that they didn't violate statute because they gave the family animal, the grieving family, by the way, animal bones. That's the kind of pressure that the lawyers are exerting. Okay? So that's why we need to continue to be standing there with them. Classy, represent Stephen and Brendan with class and everything, because we don't want to be seen as trashy. So just remember to be classy, but remember to be firm and be vocal in your support for Stephen and Brendan. Don't use insults and use the facts, because the facts are powerful in this case, because the facts don't work in the state's favor. They don't. They just don't. That's why I'm talking about these bones and all the problems wrong with them. How much have I pointed out tonight? Quite a bit. Quite a few things with the bones alone that are an issue, and so that's what we've been kind of going through here tonight. I will leave a couple of my videos about the bones, a couple of my previous videos about the bones down below. So I hope you guys have all enjoyed this video tonight. It's, obviously a big deal that what's been happening with the bones. That's why it's coming in at number 3. And, Kathleen Zellner's on them, and obviously Stephen Drizzen and Laura Nyrider are not going to give up either. And they're going to continue to exert pressure. And listen, as long as the lawyers are here exerting the pressure, it helps that we're all here standing with them, because we make that white hot spotlight even more intense on them. And like I said in a video the other night, flip or slip. Flip or slip, right? The new possible mantra for Stephen and Brendan supporters. Ultimately, with the white hot spotlight, we hope for a flip or slip. Okay. That's about it for this one, folks. If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. And we'll see you.